Hi everybody and welcome to Run Tall, the YouTube channel that's dedicated to all runners everywhere. I'm Tim and I upload new running videos every single week. Today I've got a shoe comparison for you. It's two carbon-plated racing shoes. It's the Saucony Endorphin Pro versus the Hoka Rocket X. There's a lot of similarities between these two shoes, but there's some also pretty significant differences. Now, if you want to skip around in this video or skip ahead to the parts of it that are most interest to you, I've made it pretty easy. All you have to do is open the description and there you'll see that I've laid out some chapters. Simply click on the timestamp for the part of the video that you want to watch and it'll take you right there. Before we get started, I'm going to demonstrate what it looks like to run in these shoes. And then when we get back, we're going to take an in-depth look at both of them to see which one might be right for you. So you may have noticed that I took these shoes out basically on the identical run or loop around my state park. Also, the weather conditions were about the same. It was in the low 30s for both of these runs that I took these shoes out on. So I really am comparing apples to apples as I talk about these two shoes and their similarities and differences, as well as some differences in their performance. And we're going to start by talking about the cost of the shoes. Now, the Saucony Endorphin Pro is the more expensive of the two options, and it costs $200 US, while the Hoka Rocket X costs $180. The weight on these shoes, exactly the same on my scales. Now, I wear a men's size 9, and they both weighed 7.4 ounces on my scales, or 211 grams. One interesting thing I'm going to note just while I'm thinking about it is when we get to the performance piece, I'm going to share with you some results of a time trial. Now, I am training for a half marathon in week 3, and I'm using Garmin Coach. Amy is the coach that I chose to go with this time around. In the past, I've used Greg. So if you're familiar with the channel and you've watched some of those series, you'll recall that Greg was my coach in the past. But I have Coach Amy now. And she calls for a time trial to be run at week 3. And that was right at the time that I was running in the Hoka Rocket X. So I took that out on that time trial run. A week later, so this week, they were having me run another time trial, or Amy scheduled another time trial for me to run. And so I decided for fun that I would take the Saucony Endorphin Pro out and see how that did under a similar workout. And I'm excited to share with you when we get to the performance part of this video, the results of that time trial. Okay, so now let's just dive right in and start looking at some of the similarities and differences. And I'm going to start with the upper on both of these shoes. Now you'll notice that both of these shoes, because they're racing shoes, they're pretty lightweight, stripped down, very breathable. And we'll start with the Hoka Rocket X first. And you'll notice it has a ton of perforations up around that toe box. And it is an open engineered mesh material is how Hoka describes theirs, which is similar to the Saucony Endorphin Pro. That's also an engineered mesh material. But you'll see that there's really not much else going on with that upper. With 3D overlays or prints, they have their Hoka logo that's kind of sprawled across that midsection of the shoe. And then as we work our way back around to the heel counter, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a plastic overlay, some reflective material in that area. Now, as we move over to the Saucony Endorphin Pro, again, lots of perforations up in that toe box. Not much else going on in terms of overlays. Very similar to Hoka that way. They have their Saucony logo as a 3D print in that midsection of the shoe. And as we work our way back around to the heel counter, there's really not much going on back there at all. One of the things that I will note is between these two shoes, the Hoka Rocket X is far more breathable. It's really noticeable, guys. So when I first took that shoe out, the very first run, it was cold that day. The minute I got out of my car and took off to start to run, I could feel that cold air on my toes almost immediately. So, if you're running in an area that's hot or warm weather conditions, the Rocket X is definitely going to have a bit of an advantage in terms of breathability. That's not to say that the Endorphin Pro isn't lightweight and breathable, because it is. It's very comfortable underfoot. It's just that Rocket X, that Hoka, boy, they just did a fantastic job when it comes to the breathability. Now let's take a look at the lacing system on these shoes. And this is really kind of the one knock I have against the Rocket X in terms of their upper. And that's I just seem to have to really cinch those laces down and pull that material together to get a snug fit. And I had mentioned, I think in the last comparison video I did with the Rocket X and the Fuel Cell RC Elite, that I almost have to pull, it feels like I'm pulling that material completely closed together in order to get that cinched down feeling that I like to have across that midfoot. But other than that, that eyelet chain is pretty simple, very basic. Same with the Endorphin Pro, very simple, very basic. Now I did feel a little more comfortable with that lockdown feeling across the midfoot in that Endorphin Pro, because I didn't have that issue where I felt like I had to cinch all that material together to get it to lock down. The other thing I'll note, though, is that there is a big difference in the heel cup area. And, I'll talk about that more in just a second. But the Hoka Rocket X, I just felt like my heel was better seated in that shoe. And I felt a little bit loose in the Endorphin Pro. Now let's look at the tongue on both of these shoes. And, they both have gusseted tongues, although there is a slight difference. The Endorphin Pro has basically a full gusset on one side and then a semi-gusset on the other side, while the Rocket X is semi-gusseted on both sides. Now, I didn't have any issue with either one migrating around or bunching up on me when I was out running. They both felt really comfortable. I will note that the Endorphin Pro, the tongue on that shoe, is much thinner, much more lightweight material. The Rocket X, it's not padded so much, but it is a thicker material that they made that tongue out of. Now let's turn and we'll look at the padding around the heel collar and tab of the shoes. And there is a difference here. With the Hoka Rocket X, they've got a pretty generous amount of padding around that heel collar and in that tab area. I found it to be really comfortable. They have kind of a notch or a cutout for your Achilles heel or Achilles tendon there in that heel tab. And that was really comfortable. Now with the Endorphin Pro, they basically have their padding concentrated more in the tab of the shoe, more in that heel area. It was comfortable, but you don't have nearly as much basically no padding on the collar of the shoe. So if you're looking for a shoe that is going to give you some padding around that, around your ankle area, if that's an issue for you, then the Rocket X is going to have a bit of an advantage here. And remember, both these shoes weigh exactly the same. So it's not as if you're sacrificing weight for extra padding in either shoe, because they are identical in their weight. Now let's take a look at the heel count, or the heel counter on both of these shoes. And, there is a difference here, a big difference here. Now, as we give them the bench test, you'll notice that the Endorphin Pro, there is no structure in that heel counter at all. It's really flimsy, and I think that accounts for why I felt like my heel was so loose in that shoe when I run in it. Does it impact its overall performance? Well, I'll talk about that here in a bit as we do when we get to the performance piece. But yes, it does. You don't feel as locked in or secure in the heel of the Endorphin Pro as you do in the Rocket X. And you'll notice with the Rocket X, you give it the bench test, it's a noticeable difference in the structure in that heel counter. There is a lot of stability there. And when I talk about stability, oftentimes because I overpronate, when I talk about stability, I generally talk about pronation. And with the Rocket X, it's a really stable shoe. For those of us who overpronate, this is a really good option for a carbon-plated racing shoe. Now let's look at the midsole on these two shoes. And with the Endorphin Pro, you've got basically 33.5 millimeter stack height in the heel and a 25.5 millimeter stack height in the forefoot for an 8 millimeter drop from the heel to the toe, or offset. And they have an S-curve carbon fiber plate that's sandwiched in that PWRRUN PB based foam of theirs. It's really responsive. Now that carbon fiber plate is stiff. It's one of the stiffer carbon fiber plated shoes that I've run in. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're an elite runner and you're used to running, I would say more towards your forefoot, definitely mid to forefoot foot strike. You're going to get a lot of energy return out of this shoe, and I think you're going to find it to be really enjoyable to run in, and a very fast or quick shoe underfoot. Now let's turn and we'll look at the Hoka Rocket X. It has a 32 millimeter stack height in the heel and a 27 millimeter stack height in the forefoot for a 5 millimeter offset from the heel to the toe. And they have their carbon fiber plate that runs in their EVA foam. Now they have meta rocker technology, which simply means that they start sculpting that foam and they use that carbon fiber plate so that it starts to taper or curve right around that metatarsal head of your foot to give you a nice rocker feeling as you go through. Now, similar with the Saucony Endorphin Pro, theirs is called speed roll technology. So it's very similar in the approach that they have with these two shoes. The big difference, though, is in the stiffness of the carbon fiber plate. The one in the Hoka Rocket X is much more forgiving. In fact, I think if I didn't know that it had a carbon fiber plate, I might not necessarily recognize it right off the bat when I was running. But it has a lot of energy return, much more than I expected it to. And if you're familiar with the Carbon X, or if you run in that shoe and maybe you were disappointed because of the cushioning or even that stiff carbon fiber plate that they have in the Carbon X, this is an upgrade to that, in my opinion. That's foam underfoot, that EVA foam, they call it, their most innovative foam that they have, very responsive. And I have to agree with Hoka's description in this one. It is very responsive, and it is much more cushioned than the Carbon X is. And I felt like it was more cushioned than the Saucony Endorphin Pro that we're comparing it to here today. Now let's flip these shoes over and we'll take a look at that outsole rubber that protects that precious PWRRUN foam, PB-based foam in Endorphin Pro, and that innovative EVA foam that Hoka has. Now you'll see that they're pretty equal here. As we look at that placement of the carbon rubber that the Saucony has around the Endorphin Pro, you'll see that it's around the heel area, and then they've got it starting basically up, covering that forefoot of their foam, but also very similar placement. You've got in the Rocket X, you've got rubber in the high abrasion areas, in that heel area, as well as up through that forefoot. I think both of these shoes are going to be pretty durable. And, I'm expecting to get about 400 miles out of each of these shoes. So I think in terms of durability and the number of miles that you'll be able to run in them, I think, they're pretty comparable. At least in my opinion, I think they're going to be. So let's talk about performance, because that's really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And, both of these shoes are very fast. There's a big difference, however, in how they feel underfoot. So the Saucony Endorphin Pro feels a little stiff to me. It's not quite as natural feeling through my gait cycle as the Rocket X is. And the amount of pronation that I get in the Rocket X, I feel much more stable underfoot that way. So when I talk about stability, I typically am referring to pronation, or in my case, overpronation. And I do have a bit of an issue with that with the Endorphin Pro, although not as bad as I do in some of the other carbon-plated racing shoes that I have that I've run in. I can still run pretty safely and pretty quickly in the Endorphin Pro for, up to a 10K half marathon. I don't know that I would want to go past a half marathon distance in these shoes just because of the way my biomechanics are and my gait cycle. I think the Hoka Rocket X, it fits me and my style of running, much better from that regard. So let's talk about the time trial that I did in both of these shoes. Now, as you recall, I mentioned early in this video that, I'm training for a half marathon. A part of the workout for week 3 was for me to run a time trial, which I did in the Hoka Rocket X. So you'll see up on the screen now the results of that workout. And we're looking at lap 3. So the format for this workout was I warmed up for 5 minutes, and then I ran, hard for 1 mile, and then I cooled down for half a mile. And you can see my pace in the Hoka Rocket X was a 6:28-minute mile, and that's pretty solid for me. So I was really happy overall with that pace. Now let's take a look and see a week later. So week 4, Coach Amy, my Garmin coach, had me run another time trial. And for fun, I took the Endorphin Pro out. And again, here we're looking at lap 3. Now there was a slight difference in the workout. I was still to warm up for a half a mile, but this time I was to run full out for 5 minutes, as opposed to going for a full mile. And that ended up being about 3/4 of a mile. So there's a slight difference in the format of these workouts, but close enough that I felt like it was fun to share it with you. And you'll see that my time was a 6:44-minute mile. So I was clearly faster in the Hoka Rocket X. And that surprised me just a little bit. That shoe is so quick underfoot, and it has now become my favorite shoe to run in, and it's at the top of my list to be running in these shoes for my next half marathon. In fact, I'm going to be running in them shortly as Thanksgiving approaches. I do a turkey trot with my family members. And it'll be fun to take them out for that Thanksgiving turkey trot 5K. So it'll be a short, faster race. So I'm excited to give it a try then. Hey, I enjoyed making this video for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe give it a thumbs up. As always, run tall, run strong, be kind to one another. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.